Bad Times at the El Royale is written and directed by Drew Goddard and stars the likes of Chris Hemsworth, Jeff Bridges, John Hamm, Cynthia Erivo, Dakota Johnson and a few other people as well, and basically revolves around these group of strangers all arriving at this hotel called the El Royale, which its gimmick is basically that it sits directly on the border between California and Nevada. And these strangers all have very secret pasts that all manage to somehow link to the hotel itself. And yeah, shit gets crazy. First up, I want to apologise if my voice sounds a bit crap in places because I'm just starting to get over a cold and this is the best chance I've had to film this review, so if it sounds a bit crap in places, again, I apologise. I would have had this review out much sooner in the week, but unfortunately this cold is the thing that has stopped me from getting out sooner than I would like. But that being said, I'm going to get this review out as best as I can because I do have some really interesting thoughts on this movie, especially considering the reception it's getting from everyone else, because I was hoping this movie would kind of be a runaway hit with both critics and audiences. The way it was advertised, the fact that you know, considering the people that are behind it, I was expecting it to be like an instant hit, but the reviews seem to disagree with me. Some people love this film, and some people think it's just a bit of a mess. I personally really liked it. I didn't love the movie, but I can appreciate a lot of the things that it tried to do. That being said, it does fall flat in a few areas, which stops it from being as great as it should have been. So first up, I'll get the positives out of the way. The performances from pretty much everyone are fantastic. John Hamm is charismatic and as good as he usually is. Lewis Pullman I thought was really good as the bellhop / caretaker / only staff member at the El Royale. I really liked his performance. Dakota Johnson really surprised me because, you know, I'm used to just seeing her as the girl from 50 Shades of Grey, but here she really does prove herself as a pretty good actor. That being said, the standouts for me in this film were easily Chris Hemsworth, Jeff Bridges and Cynthia Erivo. Cynthia Erivo has easily the best scene in the entire film. I'm very surprised to say that this is actually her first ever major film role. She's only really known for doing Broadway shows and stuff like that, and you can tell that Drew Goddard really took the most of that aspect of her by making her character a kind of failed singer in a sense. And yeah, her singing as well as her actual acting do play quite a major role in where her character goes and the stuff that's happened to her in the past. And like I said, she does end up having one of the best scenes in the film. I won't exactly say what that scene is because I want you guys to go in as blind as possible. But yeah, she is fantastic in the film. I love Jeff Bridges as well, who plays this priest guy who may or may not have some mysterious things that he's trying to keep under wraps from his past. He's really good in the movie. There's a certain thing they give his character that affects how much you know about his past. I won't I won't say what it is, but I thought he really handled that aspect of his character incredibly well. And then we have Chris Hemsworth, who unfortunately doesn't really come into the film properly until like the final act. But as soon as he comes on screen, he steals every single moment. He plays this kind of Charles Manson-esque cult leader / serial killer guy. He's fantastic. I loved every single moment he was on screen. He chewed up the scenery in the best possible way, but not in a over-the-top hammy kind of way. He was just that right amount of charismatic but also threatening at the same time, and I really liked what he did with his character. I also adored the cinematography and set design in this movie. You really do get a sense that this movie is set in the 60s, as they perfectly encapsulate what makes the 60s the 60s. The cinematography is incredibly crisp and stylish and very colourful, and it really works again for the time period and the overall tone this movie is going for. And yeah, just the overall look of the film is phenomenal. I love that aspect of the film. Also, Michael Giacchino's score is just right. Like, if it had gone a bit too much in one direction, then I think it would have been a bit crap. But it manages to ride that line of being subtle, but also menacing when it needs to be. For example, there's a really effective scene nearer the start of the film where there's very little dialogue going on and it's just pure visuals, and the score really does elevate that scene to make it better than it actually should be. And yeah, it's just certain moments where the score just creeps up when you least expect it, where it really does shine. However, with all that being said, the movie isn't perfect and it does fall flat in quite a few areas. The main one of them being that this movie, both in premise and execution, feels like it's trying to be a Tarantino film. Now, I love Tarantino. When he's on the ball, he's fucking great. And this movie feels like it's trying to be both Pulp Fiction and Hateful Eight at the same time, but set it in a hotel. And that's probably the best way I can describe this film. It feels like those two films slapped together whilst set in a hotel, but minus the snappy dialogue that Tarantino is famous for. Because that's the one thing that slightly lets this movie down in a few moments, specifically near the beginning. This premise and the way it's executed should work incredibly well, and it probably would work really well if it was executed by Tarantino, because when Tarantino does these multi-narrative, interlinking kind of films, even during the somewhat boring scenes, the dialogue is always there to keep you invested and entertained, whereas this movie just has its premise. It's basically just solely riding on its premise, and the dialogue isn't interesting or snappy enough to grab your full attention when not much else is really happening. Which is why the first act of the film feels incredibly slow. I think it does pick up in the second act going into the third. Those are definitely my two favourite aspects, favourite parts of the film. And that's not to say that anything good happens in the first act, because there are some really good standout bits in the first act. It's just, it does take a while to get going, and that first act feels excruciatingly slow when you compare it to the second and third, which flow in a more traditional sense with better pacing. But that first act does feel a bit arduous in terms of you have to get through it to get to the good bit, and I feel like if it had Joss Whedon or Tarantino's style of, quick, funny dialogue, then I feel like that first act would have been a lot better. And that's one thing I do have to say. I am slightly disappointed with this movie, though I still ended up liking it, with the fact that Drew Goddard's first feature film that he directed, which also happens to be the last one he did, was The Cabin in the Woods. And that film is one of my favourite films ever. And that movie was considerably shorter than this film. I mean, this film is about 2 hours, 20 minutes. Really kind of doesn't need to be that long. But what made The Cabin in the Woods work, like I just mentioned, is that whenever there was a slower or quiet moment, you'd still have the funny, punchy dialogue of Joss Whedon to complement those scenes. But Joss Whedon isn't here, so the dialogue just doesn't do enough to work on its own, which is why that first act feels as slow as it does. One aspect of this movie which is fairly hit and miss at times is the amount of twists and turns the story takes. Some of them work, some of them don't work as much, but that being said, it is one aspect of the film that I can highly recommend you go into this film as blind as possible, like I did. I only knew the basic premise, that a group of people were going to all end up staying at this hotel and then something was going to go wrong. But that's all I knew, and I think that's all you should know going into this film, because you may love some of the twists and turns this movie takes, and there were some that really worked for me in this film, but there's a few others that didn't quite have the impact that I think they were intending for. And I think the reason that is because it is a multi-narrative film, a little bit like Pulp Fiction. Each character has their own different little story that ends up coming to a bigger, much bigger overall arcing narrative by the end of the film. And the problem with that is some of them have more of a payoff than others. For example, some people's stories just kind of get dropped. And it is a little bit annoying because you do kind of want to see if that leads anywhere, but they don't. Some of them just get dropped halfway through and never get discussed again in the entire film, which is a shame, because some of the other stories that end up leading to the overall narrative aren't as interesting as the ones that do get dropped. In the end, I did still really enjoy Bad Times at the El Royale, enough to the fact that I would probably go out and see it again if I had to, which is why I'm going to give Bad Times at the El Royale an 8 out of 10. Again, I was slightly disappointed, probably seeing that Drew Goddard's last directorial film was one of my favourites ever, and I was kind of hoping for a bit more, but I think what I ended up getting was fairly enjoyable for the most part, and I would happily watch it again if I had to. So guys, that was my review of Bad Times at the El Royale. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Bye.